So I got my Irish passport in the post
Right.
2 weeks ago.
Right.
Very proud of. First applied for it 30 years ago.
Oh, gosh.
All the time, difficulty in international relations, and I was heading to China or somewhere. I thought, quite good to have one, but the queue at the Irish Embassy in London was so long. It's the days where you can walk in and get one.
Probably better if I...
Right.
You're last. Yeah. Andy's first. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Alison Atack, the President of the Law Society of Scotland, and we appreciate that there are other demands on your time today during the conference, so we're very grateful to so many of you for joining us. Of course, Brexit, the topic, is one that stands to affect us all in many ways. Thank you. Given its political and constitutional importance. Everything seems to be running about 50 minutes late at the moment, so you'll have plenty of time to listen to this and then go on to the policy slot later on. And I hope you've all had a chance to have some lunch. The UK is due to leave the European Union in 160 days. On the Law Society website, we have a day countdown, so I know that that's accurate. And it's been another busy week for Brexit discussions, very tricky, with one set of crunch talks after another. And nothing is agreed until it's all agreed, of course. But are we any closer to knowing what terms we will leave on, or whether there will be a deal at all? In fact, the body language this week in Brussels with Mrs. May having dinner at the British diplomatic residence when 100 metres away her fellow EU colleagues were having beer in the Grand Place until 1 o'clock in the morning, I think tells it all. And apparently one tourist went up to Angela Merkel and asked her if there had been any progress on the negotiations, and she said, "It's a beautiful evening, let's not spoil it." And partly thanks to one of our panel members here today, while we don't know whether the UK can unilaterally withdraw or amend Article 50, we have at least put the question to the courts. Thankfully, my role isn't to answer any of the questions today, but to ask them. So I'll invite each of our guests here to make some short introductory comments. And after that, it's over to you. So please think of any questions you would like to put to the panel. I'm very lucky to have with me on the panel today Andy Whiteman, Grace O'Sullivan, and Andy Cyril. So starting with Andy Whiteman, he's very well known to us all here, and after many years as a campaigner and advocate for land rights and democracy, he was elected as an MSP in 2016. As I mentioned in my introduction, he is one of the politicians behind the legal case on whether the UK could unilaterally withdraw its Article 50 notification. We expect the European Court of Justice hearing on that in the next 6 weeks or so. But looking a little further ahead, Andy, what do the next 160 days have in store?
Thank you very much. Indeed, Alison, I have no idea what the next 100 and however many days has in store, other than that I think we're in kind of uncharted waters as far as European politics and as far as British and Scottish politics are concerned. I certainly take the view, and I think history will uphold us, that this is perhaps one of the biggest single failings of British statecraft in the post-war era. I also take the view that much of this failing is due to hardwired deficiencies in the British Constitution. And I say that particularly in regard to how very important decisions are made in, for example, referenda. We have no written constitutional code on when the people take decisions, what decisions they take, the import of that decision, the validity of that decision, the meaning, the legal effect of that decision, etc. So this whole process has taken place in a very, very political environment. Of course, started off with a disagreement, a dispute, more than that, in fact, a civil war in the Tory party, which dates back decades. And that was sought to be resolved by a promise that were the Conservatives to win the 2015 general election, that there would be a binding referendum, an in-out referendum. And David Cameron took the view that in trying to negotiate some modest tinkering around the edges of Britain's relationship with the EU, that he would win that referendum comfortably. The referendum was held, of course, we all know the results, a very, very narrow result to leave the EU in a referendum that was not binding, it was advisory. And one of the reflections of that fact is that in the Referendum Act, the Electoral Commission, any findings about unlawful behaviour in the referendum could not result in the potential overturning of the result of the referendum, as is the case in most electoral events in the UK, general elections, Scottish Parliament elections, by-elections, etc., because it was an advisory referendum. There was no question on the ballot paper about what the future should hold, whether the UK should remain a member of the customs union or the single market, for example. The Leave campaign broke the law. It was responsible for widespread lies and information. Critically, within the British state, there was no preparation for the prospects of leaving, no preparatory work done whatsoever. Article 50 was triggered in haste, without thinking through the actual consequences and how we might plan an exit from the EU. And shortly after it was triggered, we had a general election. I mean, this is not the way to proceed. And fundamentally, I think the one thing I take away from this whole disastrous process is the very early statement by Theresa May that she didn't need to make about a red line that the United Kingdom, in its negotiations, in concluding a deal, would not be a member of the single market and would not be in the customs union. And really that kind of laying down of that red line is the reason why, one of the principal reasons why we're in the pickle we are today in the difficulties over the Irish border, where the UK government is a prisoner of domestic politics, not even domestic politics, it's a prisoner of a very small number of people who are perceived to have influence within the Conservative Party. There's a very good article today by Tony Connolly, probably the best commentator on EU affairs, RTE's Europe editor, just breaking down the whole way in which the UK government and Barney have talked past each other on the significance of the December declaration in 2017 in relationship to regulatory alignment on the island of Ireland, about how the two parties fundamentally appear to misunderstand each other's stance. And of course, the events this week have shown that the backstop is absolutely key and absolutely critical. And we've been very clear in all our statements that, notwithstanding Scotland's role in all of this and the fact that Scotland voted decisively to remain within the EU, and the Scottish Government has put forward a series of papers suggesting how that position might be reflected, notwithstanding all of that, the single most important political issue in this referendum is peace on the island of Ireland. As to the future, there's no scheduled European Council meeting in November. I think it's highly unlikely that there will be a council meeting. I think we're looking at December. I think if we're looking at December, we're starting to look at some fairly serious jitters on currency markets, financial markets, and the stock market. And we could be in for a very, very, very rocky 6 months ahead. And just finally, in anticipation of the fact that the UK Parliament will have a vote, a meaningful vote on the withdrawal deal, we were very clear that one of the options that needs to be available to parliamentarians is the option of revoking the Article 50 letter. The EU law is silent on the legal effect of Parliament voting for that, and therefore the only people that can rule as to the legal effect of a letter from the UK government saying, hey, see that letter we sent you 2 years ago, going to give us back, doesn't mean anything anymore. The only people who can rule on that is the Court of Justice in the EU, and hence we've been in court for a year with Labour, SNP and Green politicians. We've got a reference to the Court of Justice now. Written submissions are due by the 30th of October. The UK government has tried to get this decision appealed to the Supreme Court. We had a hearing yesterday. There'll be a full hearing on that application on the 8th of November, so the UK government will have to submit written submissions to the Court of Justice by the 30th of October, and we've got a full hearing on the 27th of November. So the short answer to the next 6 months is goodness knows what it's got in store, but I think we all need to keep very, very alert, be extremely nimble, very, very smart, and quite opportunistic in order to uphold the views both of our own party, our electorate here in Scotland, and our friends and colleagues across the British Isles. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy, for that. That insight into our uncharted waters and the disastrous process and red lines. Next we'll turn to Grace O'Sullivan, who's the first Green Party senator elected to the Irish Senate in 2016. She joined the upper house of the Irish legislature in 2016 following many years of high-profile activism during a 20-year career with Greenpeace. A keen surfer and former Irish champion, she's always looked to the water. So with talk of customs borders being drawn down the Irish Sea, Grace, what does the Irish Green Party make of Brexit and what's ahead?
Well, I suppose I'll start by saying, Mamma Mia, here we go again. And we are in Ireland in the Green Party, and as I said in the plenary session, all parties in Ireland, all the main parties, are absolutely opposed to Brexit leaving the European Union. But what can we do? I mean, it certainly will have a massive impact on the island of Ireland. It'll have a huge impact, obviously, in the north of Ireland, but south as well. It's hard to predict the level of difficulties it will create for us as a nation. But I remember when the morning when it was clear that the UK had voted to exit from the European Union, I remember speaking to my brother who lives in London, and he said to me, the country that will be most impacted by this decision is Ireland. And I believe even these so many months and years now, as time passes, that's becoming clearer and clearer. The European Union for us in Ireland, it was an opportunity where we could stand up as a nation, as a collective, as part of the EU 28. And, very often as a country that had been colonized for so long, the European Union gave us that opportunity to exercise our own right and to stand up. And I think what became apparent when the UK decided just to make that move away from Ireland was that the eyes of many people in the UK were not towards Ireland at all. That in fact, when research was done and when the media went out and questioned people around the UK, they found that Ireland didn't really feature, that the eyes weren't to Ireland at all. And I suppose that it made us realize how important the rest of Europe is to us. And straight away we had to start thinking in terms of goods and services, movement of people, of goods, services across Europe. So what do we do now? Because in many cases we use the UK in terms of moving goods and services across, through the UK and then onto mainland Europe. So obviously we've had to think in terms of energy. If we start moving more towards renewable energies, which we need to do, but then we need to look to And if we were in a position to export, we'd look to France directly. So we started, I think as a nation, we started to, we're obviously everyone's obsessed with the term Brexit, but we start to look at how can we get around the UK. And that's a shame, because we are a country that has had trade and had such good relations with the UK for so long. And I think this, as I started, the Mamma Mia, here we go again, the situation we're currently in, this absolute uncharted water, but the insecurity of the Tory government, the pro Brexiteers who are just creating this very negative energy, and that's spinning off. It's having a really a huge impact on the Irish people. So we are completely dominated day in, day out with the thought of Brexit and the impact it's going to have. I mean, are we going to have a transition period? What does that mean for Ireland? You know, in a way, we have our European partners and the Barnier and the other people who are negotiating with the Irish government, trying to negotiate with the UK. But so we are definitely needing and requiring and working more with the European Union and Commission to try to strengthen our own case. But I mean, the backstop is just a huge issue, you know, the Good Friday Agreement, the eroding or undermining of it. So, like, to think, and like the Taoiseach of Ireland, Leo Varadkar, said last week, and it really did, it shook us all. He said, could this mean that we are back into the potential of conflict on that frontier, on that border? So when we in the Green Party, when we want to work in solidarity and unity with the European Union and with all the partners in the European Union, including, for now, the UK, and when we see that the opportunities that are facing our planet, the issues of climate change and the issues, there's so many issues where we need to work in solidarity and cooperation. And when we recognize the European Union is not perfect, absolutely, there's no doubt about it. And there is the difficulty around bureaucracy and that sense of individual control. But the way that Brexit is leading us is just hugely concerning. And the thought that structures like a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, it just feels like we're going in completely the wrong direction. So again, it is, you know, we're in a turbulent time, uncharted water, and we feel like the victims because we are trying to exercise some control. But I truly believe that the UK government and Theresa May, that their actions currently are causing untold instability. And I hope you have a decision here today to make, pass some motions and that might go some way to help to put pressure back on the UK government to consider changing position. I don't know if it's reality, but I mean, you have some opportunity today to make a good decision around that. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Grace, for that stimulating contribution. Huge problems facing Ireland, definitely. And the ABBA theme continues. At least I didn't dance onto the stage or something. I gather the Irish border has its own Twitter account. I saw that the other day, just so that it's not forgotten about. So we'll turn to Andy Cyril now, and he's the co-founder of Just Right Scotland, where he heads up the Scottish Refugee and Migrant Centre. He's been working in human rights law since 2010, including a stint at the Council of Europe, supervising the implementation of judgments from the European Court of Human Rights. Along with his work on migrant equalities, women's rights and children's rights, the SRMC has delivered training, policy contributions and research on the subject of Brexit. So Andy, what do you see coming over the next few months?
Thank you very much. That is an extremely difficult question to answer, and I find myself saying this a lot with Brexit, but who knows? I was going to share a few brief introductory thoughts with you today on immigration law and Brexit, and a brief thought on the Irish border question. So simple, straightforward stuff, really. Now, immigration law in the UK can broadly be, or crudely be, split into two areas. Is UK immigration law, which applies to non-Europeans, and there's European law, which applies to our 3 million plus European nationals in the UK. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, they're both notoriously complex. Since 2010, there have been over 45,000 changes to UK immigration law, and the Immigration Act normally comes out every couple of years. The immigration rules themselves have doubled in length since 2010. They're now up to 375,000 words. European law is not as complex, but it still requires careful consideration. But there's a trapdoor with European law. The trapdoor is that actually not many Europeans in this country have had to consider it before. And they did not generally require leave to remain or visas to be here. That was the beauty of free movement. And now we are required to think about comprehensive sickness insurance, retained rights of residence, derivative rights of residence. Very, very complicated things. And so what we did is we've added Brexit in there. Now, whatever your view on Brexit, it is not exactly the bastion of simplicity, common sense, high-quality information. It's created a situation where we now require to register 3 million plus European nationals, or rather the ones that wish stay on our shores. The Home Office have been working hard to put in a system in place to do this. It's called the EU Settlement Scheme. It goes live on the 29th of March 2019, Brexit Day, if we get a deal. So that's the first problem. The early signs of the process, I must admit, I don't often say this about the Home Office, but they're actually quite positive. There's supposed to be a streamlined online process. You can even do it on your phone. There's an app. But it's not perfect. Free movement ends, as we know it, on the 31st of December 2020. The settlement scheme closes on the 30th of June 2021. And after that, it's the big bad immigration rules. So the clock is ticking. It will require all EU nationals to register and obtain either pre-settled or settled status. Not everything is clear. There are really real worries about the vulnerable in our society. What about domestic violence survivors separated from their European ex-husbands? What about children in care? What about those with disabilities? Questions have been asked and they've not been answered properly. What we all need to focus on is, first of all, obtaining answers to those questions from the UK government. And second of all, and this is super important, and we can all help in doing this, we need to get as much information as possible to our European nationals and our European communities ASAP. Failure to do that will lead to dire consequences, as we've seen with our Windrush generation. Indeed, this could be Windrush on an industrial scale. Our European nationals need to know what to do. And a quick word on the Irish border question. For me, a soft border, as we have now, or not. That's it. It's a binary choice. And here's the legal reality. The Good Friday Agreement has the status of an international treaty between the UK and Ireland. It's also the basis of the domestic relationship between the North and the Republic. It's the cornerstone of the Devolution Agreement, the Northern Ireland Act in 1998. It brought a fragile peace to the island. And if you actually read the text of the Good Friday Agreement, which I suspect a lot of people who commentate in the media, or politicians indeed, haven't, the majority of the key facets require a soft border. The legal reality is that a hard border is the effective erosion or breaking of the Good Friday Agreement. And here's what I see as the political reality. The EU wants a soft border, Mr. Varadkar wants a soft border, the DUP wants a soft border, Theresa May wants a soft border. Under existing UK, Irish and EU law, to do so requires compromises. And that's how we have the backstop, or indeed the backstop to the backstop. And certain members of the DUP and Conservative Party advise that those compromises are not acceptable. And they've failed to put in writing anything that suggests any alternative which protects the Good Friday Agreement. For me, it's a choice between protecting at all costs the agreement that transformed relations, businesses, lives and largely brought an end to a conflict that lasted almost 40 years, or, if you know your history, 400 years. Or we can satisfy a minority of MPs within the Conservative Party. That is the choice. It's binary. And not to finish on a downbeat note, but we've just been told we've got 12 years to save the planet. So what happens next, I don't know. We'll have to see. But what we do know is that we need to work together in order to find a way through it.
Thanks very much, Andy. Thanks. Thanks for explaining about the EU settlement scheme and finishing on a downbeat, an even more downbeat note.
Sorry.
Before I open the floor to questions, I'd like to just say a few words about the Law Society's work on this matter. And we represent 12,000 solicitors, but we also have an important role as the guardian of public interest in relation to the legal profession. And for us, this means many things. We have an outstanding group of volunteers, like Andy, in our many policy committees, bringing together experts on agricultural law, criminal law, banking, constitutional law, immigration, and much else. And these committees feed into the policy development and legislative change every week in Holyrood, Westminster, and Europe. We've been closely monitoring the main developments arising from the UK's vote to leave the EU and actively promoting the interests of our members and the public to politicians and civil servants. We will continue to do so throughout the negotiations and in the implementation of the withdrawal agreement. And we're formal members of the Ministry of Justice Brexit Law Committee, which is taking a particular interest and lead in the justice issues which arise from Brexit, and reviewed specific risks which could arise from a no-deal scenario. The UK at present, of course, remains a full member of the EU until further notice. There are no changes in the legal position for the time being, and the ultimate impact on our rights and obligations will depend on the outcome of the withdrawal agreement and the new relationship between the UK and the EU. The legal profession, who are experts in interpreting and working with our laws, do not have all the answers yet. In fact, a survey of UK's largest firms showed 94% of board members felt their business was well prepared for Brexit, whereas only 53% of their legal advisors agreed with that. So there's a big gulf there. There will be unprecedented legal challenges ahead, and experts will be more important than ever. The UK's exit has so many significant aspects, including economic, financial, legal, social, and cultural, which will affect every person living in Britain and also has much potential to affect many people living in Europe in the same way, which at the moment is currently unpredictable. Key issues where lawyers will be called on to advise include stability in law, cross-border freedom, security, justice issues, recognition of citizenship and employment, continued professional recognition within the EU, rights of audience before the EU courts, and respect for legal professional privilege as it applies to Scottish solicitors. Legal knowledge in Parliament will of course be required in buckets full to deal with the changes to an estimated 1,000 regulations in the UK and for the hundreds in Holyrood. Trade will be an area where lawyers' skill will be required. Trade agreements can be used to effect a wide range of changes in the relationship between states and regions, and the means to promote or reinforce the application of the rule of law. The legal services sector facilitates trade across all other sectors. And legal knowledge is needed in continuing protection of intellectual property rights, promotion of competition, and facilitating flows of data. There will require to continue to be cooperation of mutual recognition and enforcement of judgments, important in allowing citizens and businesses to resolve disputes. And provision will have to be made, of course, for disputes between EU and UK in relation to the interpretation and enforcement of whatever agreements are concluded. So the future could be said to be quite good for lawyers. Don't quote me on that one. And of course, we must always remember that Scotland is a distinct jurisdiction, and this should be taken into account in pursuing all trade agreements and included in all negotiations. Businesses of all types are increasingly international in focus and global in reach, and lawyers must be able to provide services accordingly to assist clients to exercise rights and meet obligations post-Brexit. So in the face of all the uncertainty we've just heard about, we know that there's a challenging task, and we have to communicate the key legal, business and citizenship challenges ahead to our members and lawmakers. And events like these, creating a platform for open, informed debate, are just one of the ways we seek to do that. We're extremely fortunate to have a huge resource in our hundreds of expert volunteer committee members, and they devote time to helping provide advice to policymakers on the challenges ahead. So please, all of you, get in touch via our website, or of course contact one of our 12,000 members for advice on how Brexit will affect you and how we can support your work. So I'll move on to questions now, and please, if you do have questions to ask, would you mention your name and who you represent, and frame the questions around the topic. And please, questions, not long statements about Brexit, if possible. Time is short. We do have till about 10 to 1, and perhaps, are there any questions for the panel? The
Lady in the pink there.
Lady. Maybe I should put my glasses on.
Hello, Linda Hendry from Stirling. My question is really for Andy Whiteman. Does the case need money from ordinary people, or is it being paid for by the Scottish Government?
No, the Scottish Government's got nothing to do with this case at all. If you go to the Good Law Project website, there's an English barrister called Joe Mom, who's running a crowdfunder to fund this case. Having said that, it's been opposed every single way. We've had to appeal every single step of the way, and the costs are enormous, and our legal team is doing this at quite incredibly reduced costs. But yeah, there's a crowdfunder. If you just go to the Good Law Project, you'll find a crowdfunder there. I'll tweet it out.
Can you just remind us of the timeline of when the next process is?
So by the 30th of October, that's next week sometime, which is the week after, that's the closing date for written submissions to the Court of Justice. So the UK government will presumably, I don't know what the UK government will do, we've tabled written submissions saying why we think Article 50 can be unilaterally revoked. Other parties, including EU states, can also intervene and make certain statements. Then there'll be a full oral hearing, probably before the full bench, actually, of the Court of Justice on the 27th of November. They're doing it through what's called an expedited procedure because they realise the importance of this topic, and they realise the importance of coming down with a ruling prior to the UK Parliament voting on the final deal. So that's the kind of timetable. Notwithstanding the UK government wants to kick this all into the long grass, I don't think it'll be successful.
Any other question?
Thank you. I'm Nigel Bagshaw from Edinburgh and a freelance translator for the European Court of Justice. So I follow this very closely. My question is whether all along there's only been two options for the UK with Brexit. Either you have a hard Brexit with an isolated UK and all the consequences that entails, or whether the UK stays in the EU in all but name. Because I can't personally see any options between those two?
Andy, would you like to?
So I'm taking great care not to delve into politics. I'm here in my role as a lawyer. What I would observe is that, from my own personal perspective, it seems to me that Brexit has been defined after the fact. Prior to the fact, we were told about Norway, and we were told about Switzerland, and we were told about Canada. And I suspect that a number of voters who went to vote Leave had one of those things in their mind. But it seems that after the fact, after the vote has happened, we have in fact been told that it was not Norway, it was not Switzerland, it was not Canada, it was something else. And so it's difficult for me to really come down on that question. We didn't have a clear understanding of what it was in the first place. I don't see why it can't be Norway. I don't see why it can't be Switzerland. I don't see why it can't be Canada. But that wasn't clear to me as a member of the voting public at the outset.
Grace, do you have anything?
Yeah, I suppose it's quite stark. It's a hard or soft, you know, like what is the impact going to be of a hard Brexit? And I don't think anyone wants to, certainly here, we don't want to acknowledge that that's a potential. And the Irish government, I mean, are working as hard as they can to try to protect the Irish, obviously the Republic of Ireland, from that stark prospect. So it's just that there's so many variables at play at the moment. And like you indicate, I mean, there's so many areas of our economy, but also, as you said, you know, women's rights, domestic rights, the taxes. It's such a complex area. It's just a pity that we've got this far with so little done, and yet we have the pending deadline, which is, it feels like everyone's been backed into a corner, and that'll never deliver the type of result that we're looking for in Ireland, that's for sure.
Andy, do you have anything?
No, catch up later.
Right, okay. Another question?
Hi, I'm Cass McGregor from Glasgow. I was just wondering what scope there is for Scotland and potentially Northern Ireland to have a different relationship with the EU than England and Wales. So there's been some talk of keeping those parts of the UK in potentially the customs union or the single market or whatever. So I was just wondering what the reality of the situation is with regard to that.
I suppose just to react quickly is, I mean, there hasn't been a government in Northern Ireland for over 2 years now. So, I mean,
There's no one to talk to.
there's no one to talk to other than the DUP who are propping up your own government at the moment.
I mean, the fact is the EU is a very flexible institution, and you know, Switzerland has its own arrangements. It created the European Economic Area with the other 3 EFTA members. It has a customs agreement with Turkey. So it could, if it wished, reach a bespoke agreement with the UK. I think the boat has sailed on that. I think the EU's willingness to negotiate a bespoke deal for the UK is heavily compromised by the refusal of the UK government to entertain any arrangement that effectively doesn't respect the Good Friday Agreement. And, you know, so it doesn't want a potential border in the Irish Sea, so the UK government would not want any other potential internal borders in the UK with differentiated solutions for each part. The UK government's against that. So the EU, although I think would be open to that, it's a domestic matter as far as the EU is concerned. And if the UK government's not willing to do that, then the EU's not going to do anything on that. So the short answer is yes, it's perfectly possible. And the UK, the Scottish government's paper back in December 2016 set that down quite clearly. But the UK government set against it. So politically, it's not a runner. Apart from, of course, the special case of Northern Ireland, where it has to be a runner because we are bound by an international treaty that we have to respect.
My name is Donald O'Herlihy, and it's a question for Andy Cyril, actually. I've seen mixed messages coming out about the need for Irish citizens to register under the EU citizenship requirements from the Home Office. Some things say that they don't under historic arrangements between the Republic of Ireland and the UK. Other things saying that all European citizens or citizens of European countries have to register. Have you seen anything of clarity on that, either one way or the other? Thanks. Sorry, I should stress, actually, Alison, I'm not looking for some free legal advice on this, but I just
No, it's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it because I have an answer. Well, I have an answer according to the current state of play with the EU settlement scheme, like the statement of intent that's been released. The answer is no, Irish citizens will not need to register under the EU settlement scheme. Their family members, if they are not Irish, do. So if you're an Irish citizen living in Glasgow and your wife or husband or partner is from the United States or is from Germany, they will require to register. Yeah, no worries.
And could I just say, I think it would be unlawful for the UK to say anything other than that, given the terms of the Government of Ireland Act 1920.
That's right, yeah. I mean,
Common
there are
travel area.
existing legal arrangements between Ireland and the UK that rules that out. So, yeah.
Right, anybody else want free legal advice?
I think the gentleman in the green hoodie there had his hand up for a while. But
Thanks, Gordon Mingus from Glasgow. As someone with family who are in and are from Northern Ireland, I'm particularly interested in the interaction between on the island of Ireland. So I wonder if maybe Grace could give us an insight into, apart from changing that Irish border Twitter account to be a protected account, what preparations are the Irish government making in the event of a no deal, particularly with reference to looking after the rights of people in Northern Ireland to regard themselves as Irish?
What preparations is the Irish government for a no deal?
I'm not too sure. I mean, because there's so many complexities. You know, the negotiations are going on. Ireland has initially, the government, we're very dependent on Commissioner Barnier, and the Irish government are making their case as much as possible. But things are being put in place, so resources were being put in terms of at the port to ensure there was enough staff available. So 500 staff were deployed, so to be recruited and deployed to the port. And in terms of customs excise, the duties, I mean, that's all been considered. But Ireland is, I mean, it is the biggest single issue in the country at the moment, and obviously, I mean, an issue, I mean, it is so pertinent and important. I mean, I keep thinking of climate change, you know, where we are with climate change. If we could get the same intensity and focus, but the timeline. So the government is making measures. Industry and agriculture, I mean, they're going to be hugely affected by this. So there are meetings going on around the countries, like almost like focus group meetings of different agencies in Cork, in Galway. The business community are facilitating meetings to try to prepare. But initially, when the decision was taken, it impacted on our markets straight away because of the relations we have. For instance, you know, the UK is a huge importer of Irish mushrooms. So immediately it impacted on that market. But I suppose the point is it's creating a huge instability. And again, I go back, the fact that there's so many variables, it's so unsure. People are trying to prepare for this event in the uncharted waters. But certainly the discussions, the resources are being deployed. Discussions are taking place in all sectors to try to prepare for something that we don't even know how it's going to emerge. So it is very difficult.
Any other questions?
Jan Sinclair from Kilmarnock. I was wondering what are the legal implications if it turns out if there is a people's vote and a vote to go back to being as we were before in the EEC members. So how would that work out, especially the legal implications of the democratic vote? I mean, can that be reversed?
So the Parliament in the UK is sovereign, and it can reverse the decision potentially. Of course, a lot of that hinges on whether Article 50 is unilaterally revocable or not. If the Court of Justice says it's not unilaterally revocable, then we signed ourselves away when we sent the Article 50 letter a year and a half ago. So on the presumption that Article 50 is unilaterally revocable, then a people's vote could potentially lead to the UK staying in the EU, provided that the people's vote has an appropriate question in it that contains that option, and that's not clear, provided that the legislation for that makes clear that the result will be binding, and that that binding result has clear narrated consequences in the legislation. It says what will be the result and what will happen afterwards. That has to be in the Referendum Act. And if those two conditions are met and the people vote to remain in the EU, then the legislation should instruct the government to revoke Article 50, which it will have to do, and then the UK stays in the EU. So there's a path to do that. The political obstacles to that are very, very significant, however.
Anybody else?
Thank you. That's a good lead into my question, which is... sorry, yeah, that's a good question. I'm Fabio Villani. I'm an Italian citizen living in Scotland for the last 36 years, and obviously a member of the Greens. Given that even Theresa May is making noises about an extension or having more time for negotiation, can you foresee or imagine a scenario where Article 50 may be revoked while a deal is either hammered out or not, so keeping still options open, and therefore making that unilateral revocation more attractive to people of different opinions?
So I didn't catch all of that question about one of the key things that the Court of Justice will look at in the question of unilateral revocability of Article 50 is, might this just be used as a delaying tactic? I don't think the Court of Justice will want European law, legal provisions, to be misused by member states. So I think they will probably, I'm just speculating, they will probably take some time to consider quite carefully how to avoid a member state just revoking Article 50 to delay things. They'll want that to be a meaningful and, to all intents and purposes, a final decision that only a future major political event like another referendum could reverse. Does that answer your question? Because I missed a bit of it. Yeah. As to the extension that's already been agreed, that's a period of time up to the end of 2020, during which we're meant to be negotiating our future relationship. There has been talk this week about that being extended. Some of that talk has been about 3 months. I mean, I just don't see what 3 months difference that makes to negotiating a future relationship or sorting out the Irish border. That's a nonsense. And it takes us into territory, into the next budget round of the EU. It takes us into quite difficult territory. It takes us beyond a Scottish election. It takes us into a possible UK election. So I really do think that that's a non-starter. And I think if there's not a deal on the table by the end of this calendar year, I don't think there's any way whatsoever that the EU27 will grant the UK any extension, either to Article 50 or to the transition period, because in essence, we have decided the pace at which this thing goes. We decided when to trigger Article 50. It's us who have failed to come up with the kind of proposition that satisfied both our red lines and our international treaty with the Republic of Ireland. So I don't think there's much sympathy in the EU for anything that's designed to just protract things with no clear expectation that anything different will happen as a result.
Any more?
David from Glasgow. It's a question about revoking Article 50 and the so-called people's vote. Is the understanding that if we were to hold another vote and the UK then votes to remain within the EU, that we wind the clock back to June 2016 and the UK's relationship remains exactly as it was? But as you know, Andy already mentioned the sort of the EU budget negotiations are already ongoing. It seems quite clear they don't want the UK to maintain the budget rebates and so on that it had benefited from under its previous relationship. So what I'm trying to say is, would a people's vote actually have to be on a new deal anyway, that we almost not rejoin, but that we go back to being a member under different conditions? I mean, is there any legal certainty around what that would mean?
So the plain legal, I'm not a lawyer here, but the plain legal meaning of revoking a letter that says you intend to withdraw is to say you do not intend to withdraw, and therefore you return to the status quo ante as of the date the letter was sent. So that's the UK's current membership with all the various opt-outs and deals it's got about budget rebates, all of which themselves are subject to legal agreements, so couldn't be unpicked just by revoking Article 50. Having said that, the next time there's a treaty renegotiation or anything, I don't think the EU will be giving the UK a very easy time, and could potentially make that clear at the point at which Article 50 is revoked, just as a matter of a political declaration of the other EU's 27, saying, look, we're not clear that you are keen EU citizens. Fine, stay with us just now, but you know, don't expect an easy ride next time you want to play silly buggers.
I think we've got time for maybe take those two on together.
Ian McClarty from Glasgow. A question for Grace. We've heard a lot about the lack of preparation which happened before Brexit. And obviously the discussion around the Irish border, one of the possible consequences would be calls for a border poll. Are there any preparations in Ireland for that situation arising?
A border poll?
For there to be a poll on reunification?
I know it's been discussed, but I don't know to what extent it's going to go. You know, it's realistic, given that there isn't a government anyway in the north. But so I'm not sure if it can happen. I don't know, even legally.
Well, it can't happen without a government in the north.
Yeah.
I can't remember what triggers a border poll in the Good Friday Agreement.
I can't recall either.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I can't believe we're having this conversation.
I know.
Final question then.
Alan Ritchie, Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. There's a lot of talk of the Norway model, but any time I've received a parcel from Norway, it has been held up in customs for 3 weeks while we write a cheque to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And any time I have entered the UK from Norway, we have passed through the red and green customs channels and not the blue EU customs channel. is a Norway agreement sufficient to avoid border infrastructure, customs posts, men with guns on the border in Ireland?
No, not for the UK, because Norway's not in the customs union, so there would be checks on borders, as you've experienced with your parcels. Norway's in the European Economic Area, which is the deal between the EU and EFTA, the 3 EFTA states, to create an effective single market between EFTA states and the EU. But that doesn't include, in Norway's case, a customs union. So that wouldn't... When people talk about the Norway option, they're talking about staying within one of the major pillars of the EU, i.e. the single market, or possibly both, the customs union as well. That's what they're talking about. They're not, I don't think we are talking about... I think if Britain... I mean, Britain's already made clear that if there's one of the customs union or the single market that might, at the very least, be, remained in, it is the customs union that comes first, because that's to do with frictionless trade and just-in-time deliveries and all the rest of it. So technically the Norway option is not really a model for the UK. But even if the Norway option is often talked about as well as the UK joining EFTA. And that's up to EFTA. And I'm not sure if Switzerland, Norway, who are the members of EFTA? Liechtenstein, Iceland would want the UK as members. It's entirely up to them as to who they admit. Nigel Farage used to be keen on the Norway model.
I won't say any more about that. Well, I'll have to bring this to an end so that you can all go on to your next session. And I'm sure you'd like to join with me with thanking all the panel members for the interesting information this afternoon.